Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. So, welcome to our first class of 2023. I don't know if you guys noticed in the marketing, I'm trying to change things up a little bit. So, this is now called IRONCLAD, our standard forms training. And just so you guys know, the term is ironclad, right? Is strong, ironclad contracts, if you've never heard that before. So what I'm trying to do is to make sure that you guys are educated and creating the strongest and safest and most bulletproof contracts you can. So any questions before I share my screen and we get going? Anybody? Nope. All right. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started. All right. So what we're going to talk about today and what you're looking at right now, what you see right now is the disclosure regarding agency relationships. And we always start there when we start with new stuff, right? And what we're going to talk about today is, for those of you who don't know, is the buyer representation agreement has been replaced. And that new agreement, instead of the buyer broker representation agreement exclusive, is now called the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. And along with that new document came some changes to the way that that relationship with buyers and brokers by using this contract have also changed, right? Some of the things that we do, the way we handle the forms, and some new forms were added. So we're going to talk about it because there's been some confusion since it came out at the end of the year, right? It came out in December, middle of December in 2022. So as you guys are starting to write more and more contracts, I'm getting questions about a change to the purchase agreement, which we will get to later on in the class. So first off, before I get into the buyer representation agreement, again, I always like to drive this point home with the disclosure regarding agency relationships. Remember, this form is non-binding. This does not commit your buyer to work with you. It does not commit you to work with your buyer. All it is a disclosure on how a buyer or seller can be represented by a real estate professional. That's it. You could be represented as the seller's agent, as you can see here, as a buyer's agent, as you can see here, or an agent representing both buyer and seller. And in that position, I have to have the permission of both buyer and seller to act as a dual agent. So that's it. All this form does is explain those three ways of representation. It is an acknowledgement from the buyer and you that you have disclosed this information to them and they've signed it. That's it. It doesn't bind them to work with you. And you have to have it technically regardless of whether you continue to move forward. Like if I have, excuse me, if I have a relationship with one of you guys as a buyer and we even write one offer, right? We write one offer. I have to keep your agency disclosure. Even if we don't write an offer, let's say that we just meet, have a buyer consultation, I'm supposed to get to sign that. I know we don't do that. But at the very least, this form, the disclosure regarding agency relationships, has to be dated prior to or same date as any contract that we write, whether that be an offer or a listing. And I only have to do it once. If I work with you as a buyer, and we work together and we write one offer, don't get that one accepted, and we move on, we write another offer, I could use the same disclosure regarding agency relationships. I don't have to do a new one every time I write an offer. Joseph, you have your hand up. Go for it.
Just to reconfirm, so on the agency disclosure, for the name, if it's a trust, everything's the buyer, the seller's name would be like the trust name.
The trust name. That's correct.
Okay, perfect. Thank
That's correct. Always the trust name. They're an entity. They're purchasing. Okay. Moving on. We're going to skip over the fair housing discrimination, the wire transfer. We're going to skip over that stuff for today. And we'll look at that in another class, obviously. But touch on this possible representation of more than one buyer, disclosure and consent. remember earlier when we were talking about the agency disclosure, I said that you have to get the permission of the buyer and seller to act as a dual agent. This form gives you the permission to act as dual agency. It defines dual agency a little bit farther, and we have to, and then it gives us the permission to act as a dual agent. The other thing that's important here is the offers are not necessarily confidential. I always like to remind you guys of that offers are not confidential unless there is a written confidentiality clause, and most people do not have that. So you have to understand that when you're a listing agent, right? And this is where the issues come in. As a listing agent, most listing agents will not share with you what their best offers are, what offers they have, all that stuff. They'll tell you how many of those things. But what I always try to relate to you guys as agents is if you're a listing agent, there's no reason why you can't share the information that you have for offers. As a matter of fact, my job is to procure the best offer, get the best deal for my seller. So if it were up to me, I would always be sharing that information. If I got a phone call from a buyer's agent on one of my listings and they asked me what my best offer is, I would tell them without hesitation. Because one of two things is going to happen. I'm going to get a better offer from them, or they're not going to write an offer that isn't competitive, right? It'll take them out of the market, which I'm okay with. Because the idea that I have to present the offers, every offer I get, I have to present it. If I have to present an offer that it doesn't have a fighting chance, then why am I going to spend the time presenting that offer? So again, we'll talk more detail about this later, but I just want to kind of mention that as we go past it. Okay? All right. There's the wire fraud. We're going to skip that. So here's the new form, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. For those of you that may have been familiar with the old buyer representation or buyer broker representation, this one is different. Okay? It is a different form. It has a different look, but we're going to talk about it right now. Okay. So, representation period and right to represent. The buyer's name goes there first in that first line. Grants the broker Century 21 All-Stars, okay, beginning on, so whatever date I'm going to meet with the client, right? So let's say it's today, beginning on January 12th, 2023, and ending blank days later. So a change to this form from the previous one was treated a lot like a listing. The other one was a lot like a listing where it had a begin date and an end date. It had dates. This one is just days, right? It's this many days. This is how long it lasts, and it ends on 11:59 p.m. on that date, okay? Or when you complete the resulting transaction, whichever one is first, that's it. That becomes the end of that's the representation period. The non-exclusive right, unless paragraph 4B2 is checked, to represent buyer in acquiring real property or a manufactured home. So we'll talk about that in a moment, okay? The non-exclusive right or paragraph 4B2, and we'll talk about the differences between those two. Okay, next, no pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreement. Buyer acknowledged that buyer has not entered into a representation agreement with any other broker and has no obligation to pay compensation to any other broker arising out of the acquisition of the property identified in paragraph 3, except identify other brokers and properties. So in this little section here, and if you don't have enough space in this section that's here below, this blank space, you can write see addendum, and then list any brokers that they have a representation with previously, or properties that agent has shown them in relation to that buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. And there is a form for that. I'm going to show you that also as we proceed through the class. If the buyer says, none, I don't have a previous representation agreement, and I don't have any other forms, any other properties that belong on a list, then you can write in this section, and you have to write it, buyer states none. Right? Like you want there to be that there was an affirmative statement from the buyer that they didn't have anything previously, because what happens is if they did have a previous agreement or they did have some previous property where they would owe compensation to somebody else, and you didn't have any kind of acknowledgement that you had that conversation with them, it could still affect you. In this case, what would happen is you would say, well, the buyer said no, so if there is somebody else that steps in and is owed compensation, not my problem, that's the buyer's problem, because they told me there wasn't anybody, right? I made the attempt to find out information about previous relationships with previous brokers. Okay. Next, property to be acquired. Now, here's the thing that we've got to do, and this is the same as the previous buyer representation agreement. We can't get vague, super vague or broad and just say location, state of California, or just one city, or just one very small area, because if we're too specific or we're too broad in our explanation of the properties to be acquired, the problem is that if they purchase anything that goes outside those parameters, this is unenforceable. Okay, so when we look at location, we've got to kind of be find a happy medium between broad and specific. And I know that becomes difficult. But for example, if it's just, hey, I know this buyer is only buying in the cities of Downey, Norwalk, Southgate, and Pico, well, then I can check off cities and I can write all those cities in there, right? I can put all those cities in there. That's great. Their price range. What is their price range? Now, their price range can't be 0 to 10 million. Can't be that broad. Again, it's got to be reasonable. If you have a buyer that's qualified for $600,000, their price point is probably somewhere between $550 and $625, right? Like you stretch it. So you got to be specific to what it is. Any other terms that go into the specific property, you go there. Okay. So you can name counties instead of cities. You could say, oh, LA and Orange County, great in your price range. That gives you a little broader interpretation and it allows for it. So you can now, these are changes from the previous one. The previous one was just property type and locations, and that was it. Now you can have cities or counties and do the price range properly. Or let's say that my agreement is only about a specific property, right? Because we do have that. That was one of the conversations I had recently, which was, hey, I have this buyer that wants to look at one of my, investments or off-market properties or whatever the idea is, and I want to make sure that they don't come look at it and then go with their agent and have their agent call me and do that. Well, then, yes, you could put the following specified properties only and put a list of properties, or if you have a list of properties that you're going to be showing them, you could put those specific lists. I saw Tim had a hand up a moment ago. Tim, did you have a question? Is he still
Yeah, it was
here?
back to the buyer
Mm-hmm.
and the relationship with us, the agent.
Uh-huh.
If they had a relationship with another broker or agent, and they've now canceled that, do we still need to have this on the new form, or does that suffice?
I would still write it down. I would still write it down that they had the previous one, and then just keep the copy of the cancellation that they have, because there is a specific cancellation form for this representation agreement, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But yes, you still write it in. Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we've got that. We've decided where we're going to be representing, the places they're going to look, specific properties, okay? We've got all that. Now we're going to look at the amount of compensation that the buyer is going to pay. Now, here's the thing. Really, the true use of this form is to not necessarily get the buyer to pay you, even though that's what it's there for. I always believe as you use these, it becomes more of like a moral contract, right? People feel a little bit more connected to you, less likely to, go off and find another buyer. And we know or another agent, and we know how buyers can get, right? Where, they feel like maybe you're not doing everything you should, that they're going to, just start looking with everybody, right? They're going to, every agent that they come in contact with, they're going to have a conversation with them, look at houses, do all that stuff. This having the sign that maybe it dampens that feeling of I need to talk to every agent that I possibly can. Okay, they are difficult to enforce. Let's be honest. Okay, they are, but it's always not a bad idea to have somebody, if you can see that they have the commitment to sign a contract to be exclusively working with you, then that helps. Okay, all right. So here's the compensation. compensation, blank percent of the acquisition price, and if they're going to pay you anything over, a flat rate, or you can have a compensation schedule attached. Like, let's say maybe it's dependent on the amount of the home or the amount you save them, whatever it is. You can have some kind of commission schedule attached separately. But that percentage of commission is saying that, hey, I'm going to pay you this commission. So let's say that you write in here 3%. Okay? You write that they're going to pay you 3% of the acquisition cost. Okay? And then we go and we start looking at properties, and I write an offer. And I write an offer on a property for them, and I get that offer accepted. And that commission, right, that commission that's being paid is 2.5% from the listing broker, right? Because you guys ever remember, those commissions that are in the MLS, even though it comes out of the seller's proceeds, that's being paid by the listing broker. It's not being paid by the seller. So now the listing broker's paying me 2.5%. That means there is a 0.5% gap between the 3% that the buyer has agreed to pay me for acquiring the property and the 2.5% that I'm getting paid. By the letter of this contract, that buyer owes me the 0.5% of commission. Okay? Now, I know that none of you guys are really looking at the idea of like, well, buyer, you're going to pay me. Because I know that, our buyers have to come up with a lot of money out of their pockets right now. It's not something that we generally want to do. We're using it as a tool to dissuade them from going off and writing an offer with somebody else. I mean, ultimately, that's what's happening. But legally, they owe us a 0.5%. So you've got to make sure that you have the conversation with them, and probably we're going to have to make some notes about how we handle that change in compensation. Okay, so broker right to compensation. This is where the change comes in from the previous form. Broker shall be entitled to compensation specified in 4A from buyer if during the representation period or any extension thereof, buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire any property described in paragraph 3, and the seller thereof completes this transaction or is prevented from doing so by default of the buyer as follows. Okay, so here's the default. Hold on a second. We got, can you leave it blank? So, Carlos, you're asking, can you leave the compensation blank? Is that what you're saying? Then don't use the form. There's no point in using this if you're not going to have some kind of compensation. Well, you just don't use it. Just don't use it. Okay, so broker involvement, non-exclusive representation. So this is the default of how the compensation works. Compensation is payable only if there was a broker involvement with the property. Broker involvement means any of the following. Buyer physically entered and was shown the property by broker. Broker showed the property to buyer virtually. Broker submitted to seller a signed written offer from the buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property, or the property was introduced to buyer by broker or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on the part of the broker analyzing the property for buyer specifically, or assisting buyer in potential acquisition of the property, or communicating with seller or seller's agent regarding buyer's potential acquisition of the property. Okay, so a lot. Okay, so broker involvement. What that means is that by default, this form, the buyer doesn't owe you any compensation if they go and buy, even if they buy a property that matches all the criteria that you listed in paragraph 3. If they go and buy a house, if they go on their own, look at an open house that you didn't take them to, and they write an offer with the listing agent, you are owed no compensation by the default of this contract. Okay. Now, if you want to change that, then we go down to the next one. Buyer acquisition exclusive representation. It said physically I have to check the box. This agreement shall be exclusive and irrevocable. Broker will devote time and resources to assist buyer in finding and acquiring the property in the expectation of being paid for broker services. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is entitled to be paid for representing buyer. Buyer includes any person or entity other than the broker related to buyer who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire real property described in paragraph 3. Now, if you want to get paid, If you want to make it so, hey, you can't work with anybody else, I want to lock you into me, then you have to check the box on B2. If you just leave it by default, they can go off on their own and you're not involved. You're only protected if you show them the property. You introduce it to them, not emailing them a list of properties from the MLS. That doesn't count. And I think the good thing about this is what it's saying is that, hey, look, if you're really working for me, you're taking me out and showing me. You're not just going, hey, here's some properties, take a look at them. I mean, obviously we have to do that because your buyers are going to do that anyway. But what they're saying here is you're not involved unless you actually physically go take them or write an offer on their behalf. Okay, so if you want it to be totally exclusive, meaning no matter what they do, they owe you compensation if they do it without you, then you got to check box B2, okay? And I know you're asking because the seller, and this is going back to Carlos's in the chat. Carlos is saying, well, I was asking because the seller pays the commission. Yes, the seller does pay the commission, but it doesn't mean that there is no commission to be paid. And if what happens is I go and show them a property and then they leave and go write it with the listing agent, then they owe me nothing. Right? There is no consequence for them in defaulting on this contract that we have together. So I get where you're coming from. Yeah, the seller's going to pay my commission. I don't want anything from my buyer, but then there is no consequence if my buyer does then breach this contract. Right? So you got to put something in there, whatever it is. It could be less. It could be less than what you normally get. Let's say that I know that we're going to get 2 or 2.5 on average from a listing agent. I'm just, hey, I want 1.5. If you don't buy with me, it's 1.5. And you don't have to pay that 1.5 if I get paid by somebody else. Okay? Now, we talk about cancellation. The change here is it says either party may cancel now. Either buyer or broker may cancel this agreement by giving written notice to the other. This agreement shall be terminated if paragraph 4B1 applies upon receipt of the notice or blank days after receipt, or if paragraph 4B2 applies 30 days after the receipt of the notice. So if we're non-exclusive, which if you're non-exclusive, doesn't matter anyway, you're saying, well, if they send me a cancellation in 2 days, it's canceled. Right? Or blank days, whatever we fill in. But if we have 4B2 where it's exclusive, yeah, you got to give me 30 days ahead of time to say, hey, well, I'm not working with you anymore. It's not just automatic. If the buyer tries to cancel me, we still have a 30-day agreement. They have to give me a 30-day notice, basically. Okay? Broker shall be entitled to compensation if during the representation period or any time specified in 4E, buyer acquires property for which there was a broker involvement. And there's a form called the NBIP, and I'm going to show you guys. And what that is basically it's a form now for the properties that you showed them. So let's just say that Gilbert and I work together for a couple months, and I show him a few properties. We write some offers. He doesn't get them off. He doesn't get them accepted. Whatever happens, and then he says, you know what, I don't want to work with you anymore. So we cancel. So what happens is there's this form now, the NBIP. I give him that with a list of all the properties that I showed him and wrote offers on. And I hand it to him, and I say, here you go. It's fine. You can cancel the agreement. But if in the time specified, you write an offer, get an offer accepted on any of those, you're still going to owe me compensation. Okay, so I'll show you that form in a moment. And then, let's see here. The written list of broker involvement properties shall be delivered to buyer within 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation. Before, during, and after the 5-day period, buyer is advised to notify any other broker of broker's rights during this under this paragraph. If checked, and only if paragraph 4B2 applies, neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement prior to expiration except by mutual agreement, right? So you could check that off too. You can check that off and say, hey, listen, neither one of us can cancel, right? It's not you that is never, you could cancel. I mean, I don't think a buyer, if you tell them, hey, look, I don't want to work with you anymore, a buyer's going to go, nope, sorry, you're under contract. But yes, I would suggest, if it were me, that we have that box checked, that it's only canceled under mutual agreement, okay? Accounting for payments to broker by others. Here's where we talk about the compensation part. If anyone other than buyer compensates broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited towards buyer's obligation to pay compensation, right? We talked about that already, right? So if I have an agreement to pay 2.5% and I get 2.5% from the listing agent, then my buyer's responsibility for paying me is wiped away, right? Number two, though, if third-party payments received exceed buyer's obligation, right? So if my buyer's obligation, let's say it's 2.5 and I make 3, the excess amount shall be paid to broker, or there's a box that says credited to the buyer or other. So again, the thing I don't like about this form is that you get that in front of your buyer and your buyer says, hey, wait a minute, there's a choice to get it credited back to me if you get paid more than what I was offering you. Yeah, that is an option, but not an option for me. You're going to have to be able to sell that to your buyer that you're going to get the payment. Now, it's pretty easy to do that. Hey, listen, I have this payment here just in case. That what you owe, what you would owe compensation is just in case you choose to somehow go outside of our agreement. The compensation that I get from the other broker, it doesn't cost you anything, and it's me being paid for the work that I put in to represent you and protect your interests. And think about that. I'm being paid by the other broker to protect your interests and get you the best deal possible on the property. Okay, so just be aware that that's in there because you may have to deal with that. Number 3, authorization to include commission and offer. And this is the new thing in the purchase agreement that's kind of throwing people off. Okay, we're going to talk about that as soon as we're done with this form here. Brokers shall be entitled to the compensation provided for in paragraph 4A if within blank calendar days after expiration and representation period or any extension. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking of the wrong thing. This is not what I was talking about with the purchase agreement. Representation period or any extension thereof if there is a cancellation after the effective date of the cancellation in paragraph 4C. Buyers enters into an agreement to acquire property for which there was broker involvement provided. So like a listing agreement, if you guys have been in my classes before, right? If within 180 calendar days, that would probably be my thing. 90 days would be my minimum. So what this is basically saying is this. Those NBIP forms, those properties that I've shown them, right? The properties that I've taken them to or written offers on, those things. If I give them that list, right, 5 days after we cancel or our agreement expires, in that 90, 180 days, whatever we put in the contract here, if they buy one of those properties on the NBIP list, I would be owed compensation, okay? So keep that in mind that you have to have something in this space. Maricela put in the chat, this form is dangerous. I don't know that it's necessarily dangerous. I think it's just clarifying that original agreement that we had. Look, here's the thing that I would say. Most agents don't use buyer representation agreements to begin with, right? Most of you guys don't use it. You work with your buyers on your own. You don't ever have them sign this. And to be honest, I think most agents don't sign it because they're afraid to ask buyers to sign it. Let's be honest. I think, though, if we handle it right and we learn how to explain it, there could be some benefit to how this form works and helps us to have a stronger relationship or have stronger relationships with our buyers, because from the beginning in working with a buyer and having a buyer representation or having a buyer consultation, this would be part of the conversation about how it works. I think that, look, let's look at it this way. If the listing agreement was so-called dangerous, like you guys were afraid of how it paid or what we had to do with it and everything, would you guys go sell a house without having them sign a listing agreement? Anybody go sell a house without having a listing agreement signed? I don't see anybody perking up. So if you wouldn't sell a house, market a house, do the work to sell a house without a listing agreement, like, hey, the seller says to you, just like the buyers, man, I really love you. I want to work with you. I think you're the best agent. Don't worry, I'm not going to work with anybody else. Go ahead, man, market this, and I'm going to pay you a 6% commission if you find a buyer for it. You wouldn't do a damn thing. You wouldn't, well, let me rephrase that. Some of you would probably go out and start marketing it and doing the work, because that's just what would happen. But most of us, 99% of us, wouldn't do anything without the listing agreement. But And that house is in one place. It's not going anywhere. It sits on the same street. It doesn't move. The addresses don't change. Nothing happens. It's always there in the same place. But a buyer, I'll drive around for 6 months every Saturday and Sunday showing them 8 houses a weekend, writing offer after offer after offer with just their word that they're going to work with me. So, I mean, you got to start thinking about business practices. If you wouldn't sell a house without it, why are you spending time wasting gas? It costs you much more money to work a buyer and get a buyer into escrow than it does to get a listing into escrow. You're not driving the house around showing them to buyers, right? So I just would rethink the business strategy. The benefit to the buyer for signing this, it's not really to benefit the buyer. All it is just basically putting our relationship in writing, the same as the seller. What's the benefit to the seller signing a listing agreement? There's not. It's a commitment for them to pay us, just like this is a commitment for the buyer to pay us. So, I mean, really the way how you use these forms and how you present them to your buyers and your sellers is really about how the business works and you understanding what the benefit is for you. Like, hey, listen, the benefit to the buyer, really, if you want to look at it, the benefit to the buyer is by you signing this, I'm going to really commit my resources to you. I'm going to commit my resources to you because I know you're committed to me. In the relationships we have now as buyer and agent, it's just based off of, hey, you said you like me enough to hang out with me every weekend and go look at houses. And we trust them to go do that. And I know some of you guys, you're like, you know what? That buyer is questionable. I don't know if I trust them. So you don't maybe spend the time you should. So maybe the benefit to the buyer is by you showing me your commitment to work with me, I'm going to be extra committed to you as buyer's agent. I mean, but again, you got to think about the idea of the relationships you have with your buyers and sellers. And it's your business. Whatever you think is the best business model for you, incorporating this, great. If you don't want to incorporate it, great. I don't think it's bad one way or the other. If you work with your buyers and you've had great relationship with your buyers in the past and not have any issues and you're not afraid of your buyers running off, then don't use it. If this is something that you want to put into place, then go for it. Yeah, go ahead, Virginia.
I mean, to actually follow through, I mean, how do you enforce this? Would this go to arbitration and mediation?
Could, yeah, depending on the amounts. Yeah.
So anything above 10,000, or I should say anything under 10,000 would then go to small claims if necessary?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Andy, this is an enforceable contract. Absolutely. Even if we have this sign and they go with another agent and it costs us money to enforce it, well, yeah, of course, just like it would for a listing. Like your listing agreement, I mean, guys, just think of this as a listing agreement for a buyer. If I have a listing agreement today with somebody across the street and all of a sudden they get a wild hair up their ass to decide I'm not the right agent for them and they start talking to another agent and they're trying to tell me to cancel and they go and sign another listing agreement and I'm like, no, I want my money. It's going to cost me money to fight for my money on that contract. So yeah, anytime you have to enforce something, it's going to cost you money. Every contract. There is not one contract. I hate to tell you this, guys, but there is not one contract in all of Zip Forms that automatically is enforceable. Like you just say, hey, I have this contract, and everybody stops and goes, yeah, here you go. Here's the money I owe you. None of them. Okay. Do we have many cases fighting for a commission at the office? No, we have none. And the reason that we have none is because most agents don't want to fight, don't want to start the process. It's not easy. And then to have to fight to get your, like I'm telling you guys, none of these things are slam dunks. You got to understand that. None of this stuff is slam dunks. None of this stuff is 100%. But what we're trying to do by using these contracts and these documents and all the forms that go into a real estate transaction, by doing them the right way, we're trying to reduce the chances that we have a problem, but none of them are 100%. And so we don't have these cases because usually what happens is the time spent, the mental energy that's spent for me to have to go fight with a buyer or fight with a seller to get the commission, and the months it's going to take for that to happen are going to take me outside of the business I need to do. So I got to look at it. Is it worth it to fight for one commission and give up 6 more because I don't focus on my business? Probably not. So Again, some people, I mean, it's happened, and they'll do it out of principle. They'll go after them because the people deserve it, right? They just acted like jerks, the client. And I get that. Go for it. But the majority of them, no. And no, we don't have many cases like that. Okay. Okay. Disclosure of anticipated payments by to broker by others. This is the one, or this is not the one. This is another form that says, hey, here's what I believe is the compensation on these properties I'm going to show you. I'm not going to read this whole thing. We have a form. It's called the ABCD. It's very easy to remember, but I'm going to show it to you in a moment. And that ABCD, what it says is, here's the properties we're going to show, or here's the properties I'm writing an offer on you for, and this is the expected compensation from those. So I'm disclosing ahead of time, hey, listen, I know that we agreed that you would pay me 2.5 on anything that I purchased for you, but guess what? The 6 properties that I'm showing you and the 2 that I'm writing offers on, they're paying me 2.5%. So guess what? Your liability is 0. Okay. Timing of compensation. The compensation is payable upon completion of any resulting transaction, and if escrow is used through escrow, broker shall be entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from an agreement for property specified in paragraph 3 closes during or after the expiration of the representation period. So what that means is, let's say that my representation period ends tomorrow, I get your offer accepted today, that compensation still stays into effect even though our agreement expires tomorrow. If acquisition is prevented by default of the buyer, upon buyer's default, you would have to pay that compensation. If acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer, when buyer collects damages by suit, settlement, or otherwise, compensation shall be equal to 1/2 of the damages recovered, not to exceed the compensation provided for in 4A, after first deducting the unreimbursed payments, credits, and expenses of collection and suit, if any, just like the listing agreement does, right? The listing agreement says that also. Payments are going to be through escrow, okay? Pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreements. If buyer acquires a property during the time, buyer is obligated to compensate another broker identified in paragraph 2. Broker is neither entitled to compensation under this agreement nor obliged to represent the buyer in such transactions. So if we go back to that paragraph where I said, did you have any other brokers that were representing you, or a list of properties that are exempt from me being able to, if they want to buy one of those, then you say, here you go, you want that property, I'm out, call your other agent, they are now representing you. That's how it works, okay? Agency relationships, just like we talked about, it's referencing back to the disclosure regarding agency relationships and the PRBS. Broker authorizations and obligations, again, this is just like in any other, in the purchase agreement, anywhere else, it just says, hey, here's what the broker is supposed to do. This is what the broker is not obligated to do. You can read that through that at another time. Buyer agrees to pay for reports, investigations, and meetings arranged by broker. Buyer materials. Buyer shall notify broker in writing if of any material issue to buyer, such as but not limited to buyer requests for information on or concerns regarding. So there's a form called buyer material issues. You could give that to your buyers and say, hey, buyer, if there's, can you please list on this? And it has kind of like a checkbox, the things that are important to them that they have to find out about the property. So you can do that so you have that kind of memorialized in the transaction of those things, okay? Attorney fees, everybody's going to pay their own attorney fees. Dispute resolution, it's going to go through mediation, right? And if you want to have arbitration, you have to do a separate form for arbitration, right? There's not a default of arbitration in this like there is in a purchase agreement. Same as the listing agreement is that you have to put in there that you want arbitration. Otherwise, it's mediation first, and then it would be litigation. Or if you both agree to do arbitration, it would be arbitration, okay? For those disputes like we talked about a moment ago. These are the advisors and addendas that are attached to it. We looked at that already, right? The investigation advisory is in there just like at a purchase. The transactional advisory, which I'm going to show you right now, and then the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller are attached. Okay, if there is an entity buyer, right, you got to check this box. That means if it's a trust that's purchasing or a corporation or a partnership, you got to put that information in there. If you don't put that information in, then you're going to have to later do, the representative capacity signature disclosure. Okay, so just make sure that you have that in there for the entity buyers and then their signatures. Last question. If we put 2.5 commission, sellers paying 3, we don't have to give the buyer an extra 0.5%, do we? No, you don't. I mean, it has the option here, but but the default is that you're going to get the extra 1/2, right? They're covered, they're off the hook, and you're getting the other 1/2. There is a box if you wanted to credit it to the buyer, but you don't have to do that. Okay. All right. Down to the signatures, have everybody sign, and we have an agreement. Okay. The buyer transactional advisory is a new form. Buying real property is a process that has many different aspects to it. The information below will help you evaluate your role and the roles of others in buying process. Reasonable care and professional assistance. It's really just kind of explaining to them the whole process. Who's responsible for what? Who's responsible for, like, who's going to do what? Was my agent responsible for? So it's a lot like, it's a lot like the buyer's investigation advisory, but this is specific to a transaction. So you could look through that and read it too. That's a new one. Okay, so then here's the buyer's investigation advisory. So they're very similar. Okay, so that's it. This is the consumer privacy stuff. We don't need to go into that. So that's it for the buyer representation and broker agreement. Now, the reason I wanted to show you guys that is because, number one, it's a completely different form, right? New form. Number two, I've had a couple agents ask me about it, saying that they were going to be meeting, and I wanted to let them, kind of have everybody talk about it. So let's look first at anticipated broker compensation disclosure. So I'm not going to read the whole top, but what it's saying here is that the buyer's going to sign up here, and you're going to put next to initials. Here's the property address. This section is if felt when property is being shown or when an offer is being made. So I am going to say, here it is. Property address, when we're showing it or making the offer, what the compensation is, and where the compensation was gotten from. Either I got a CBC from the listing broker or it was listed in the MLS. Okay. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have the buyer initial that they have it. And see, final compensation from persons other than buyer. Buyer's broker has received compensation for buyer's purchase of property located at, and where that compensation came from. So now I'm showing them, hey, listen, you're not paying me. This is who's paying me. So this is required if you're going to use that buyer representation agreement. This is required, this form, okay? So again, extra steps with this buyer representation and compensation than there were with the previous buyer representation agreement. But again, these kind of things help make it more enforceable than the previous form was. It just means we have to be more transparent than maybe we were with the previous form, okay? So that's that one. The buyer's transaction advisory we went over. There's a specific cancellation for that form, and that looks like this. Has the broker, the buyer, the notice, the representation may be canceled by either buyer or broker or both by signing the applicable box below in paragraph 2 and delivering to the other party. However, compensation may be still owed based on the contractual rights of the buyer representation agreement or otherwise, right? We talked about that too. So this is just the cancellation, when it's going to cancel, if they owe, right? By signing, buyer hereby gives notice, or broker, or we're going to do mutual agreement, talks about the compensation. The unilateral or broker cancellation or the mutual cancellation. So you have two different places that you're going to sign, right? So if somebody's giving you the notice saying, hey, we're canceling on you, right? Like if it's the broker or the buyer that's canceling, they would sign the top section. If it's a mutual cancellation, like a mutual agreement, then we're both going to sign the bottom section, okay? So in the chat, somebody said, where can we do? All these forms are in zip forms, right? So when you're a board member and you become a realtor, you have access to CAR, you have access to zip forms. That's where all of those forms are, okay? All right, let me get this off of here. All right, that's the cancellation. And finally, let's talk about this. Okay, so here's the purchase agreement. You guys should be looking at the purchase agreement. Right, here it is. Everything is in paragraph 3, right? If you go down here to paragraph 3G3, there's a box to check that says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement, CAR form SPBB, seller's broker's offer, if any, to compensate buyer's broker is unaffected unless otherwise agreed. Okay. So basically what this is the buyer, right? So let's say that, for example, the seller isn't offering a commission. Let's say that we find a for sale by owner, right? I introduce my buyer to a for sale by owner, and that for sale by owner says, I don't want to pay a commission. If you want a commission, get it from your buyer. And I have this buyer representation agreement. But when we write the offer, the buyer says, look, I want to include in my offer a request of the seller to pay your compensation for me. That's what this is. That's what this box is. So for the people that have had some concerns about what this is in the RPA, that's what that is. That is the buyer is requesting that the seller pay the buyer's obligation to compensate the agent. Okay? Everybody clear on what that means? Anybody? No questions? All right. So basically that's all you're asking, right? So I wrote an offer. The buyer's asking, just like I would be for, let's say I would ask for a credit just above here. I'm asking for a credit for closing costs. This is basically the same thing. I'm asking for a credit from the seller to pay my agent's compensation. Okay? So we're preparing an offer for sale by owner. For sale by owner, a seller who is not going to pay a commission. So we check this box if the buyer's asking for the seller to pay my buyer's compensation. We check that box, and we send with it the form SPBB, which becomes the request for the seller to pay that commission. Okay. Yeah. So somebody put, you only use that if you're using the buyer representation agreement. Yes, because that's the only way you would have a buyer's obligation to pay any compensation. So if you have buyers that you've never had a buyer representation agreement with, you would never check that box. Okay, because the buyer has no obligation to pay you compensation. It would only be then. And it would only be to check the box if you're asking the seller to pay that side of that person's obligation. And if there's a compensation being paid by the listing broker for the buyer's agent anyway, you wouldn't check that box. Okay? So, questions? Because I know I got a couple on there. Please read it again, repeat it. Questions? Anybody still confused on how that works with the SPBB? Now I'm going to show you the SPBB so you can see it. This is the seller payment to buyer's broker. Right? So here's the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated into the purchase agreement, dated, whatever date you wrote it, the property address, who the buyer is, who the seller is. Buyer has entered into a written agreement to compensate buyer's broker blank % of the purchase price or flat rate, whatever it is. As of the date, this seller payment for buyer's broker document is signed by buyer and pursuant to the MLS, or seller's broker has agreed to pay buyer's broker blank % of the purchase price or if checked upon completion of the property, a flat rate, right? Seller agrees to pay broker blank % of the purchase price, right? That's if the seller's going to pay it. Buyer authorizes escrow holder upon request to deliver seller a copy of the portion of the written agreement between buyer and buyer's broker identifying the amount of compensation buyer has agreed to pay buyer's broker, right? So you got to show them, right? If buyer's broker is the same as seller's broker, then the amount specified in the MLS shall apply in the manner specified in paragraph 2 and 3. Additionally, if broker has agreed in a listing agreement to reduce amount of compensation in the event of dual agency, the amount of compensation specified in the MLS will still apply to offset the compensation that buyer has agreed to pay buyer's broker. Okay? So that's it. It's only when you have a buyer representation agreement, and it's only when you're asking the seller to pay for the buyer's obligation to pay that compensation. Okay? And the last thing to show you is the notice of broker involved properties. Okay? This is the one we were talking about. If our agreement expires or cancels, here's a list of the properties that I showed you. Here's a list of the properties that I showed you or wrote an offer on while we had our agreement, and that's it, right? If checked, you're going to check this box, list of properties, and that's it. You're going to deliver that to the buyer within 5 days of the cancellation or expiration of your agreement. All right. So I know that was a lot, but again, understanding what it is, right? Because I know that There are agents that want to use it, that bring up how to use it, and when I tell them that it is, there's a new form, they're a little confused. So I wanted to clarify, kind of go through it. Again, I'm not saying that it is mandatory that you use it. I'm not even advocating that you use it. I just want you to understand what it means to use it. And again, just dismissing it altogether is probably not the right approach either, because again, like a listing, you wouldn't sell a house without a listing agreement. And I know that it's common practice for us to work with buyers. It's been that way forever and ever and ever and ever. That's common practice to work with buyers without some kind of written agreement. But even though this is a little bit more work, I do have a belief that it is probably in your best interest with some of the buyers that we're working with to have them to commit to you in some way. But again, if you choose not to use it, no problem. If you choose to use it, just make sure you're doing it properly. And if you have questions, you could always bring it to me or call me, and we'll review it and make sure everything is okay. All right. Any questions before I let you guys go? Any questions? No? All right. I really appreciate you guys being here. We will talk about something new next Thursday, and go out there and be safe and productive. Take care.